Okay, so we are moving on now. We're going through chapter 4 in the textbook, which basically deals with the issue of problem identification and agenda setting in the policymaking process. So we've, covered the sort of standard policymaking approach. Obviously, there are, problems with it, which I've already addressed, and I don't want to keep repeating myself over and over again. But um, to follow the example the the textbook, we'll sort of go through this process a little bit, as long as you don't take it too literally as an accurate reflection of how policy is actually made in the real world. I suppose following this process can at least yield some kind of insight into the various steps that go along with policy making. So again, so this chapter cover the or summarize the processes leading to public policy, evaluate public problems and construct causal stories, explain agenda setting and recognize why is an important step in the policy process, describe how ideas get on the agenda, explain various stages of the agenda setting process, and identify government actors and their role in the agenda setting process. So again, this class will mainly cover the early steps in the policymaking process. All right. So the first step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one. Policy problems arise from situations or circumstances that cause dissatisfaction for individuals or groups who then call on government to find a solution. Issue recognition occurs when a problem is first noticed and perceived to have potential for government action. Recognition involves asking what are the concerns and what are the causes of my concern. Next logical questions include, can the situation be improved? And if so, who can improve it? A good rule of thumb is to start at the local level and move to state or federal arena once other options have been explored. Problem identification is full of controversy, and policymakers often make decisions based on incomplete knowledge of the problem's origins. So again, not to belabor the same point over and over again, but you can see already from this very initial step in the process, I mean, power is almost completely, if not completely minimized or sort of removed from the equation here. Problems simply stem from, lack of knowledge or having the correct knowledge to identify what the problems are. It's just people just don't know things. Not that there's, active, power being exercised to, dominate the public discourse over what the pressing problems are and things like that. And even when these problems have been identified in many circumstances, and I'll cover a few later on here, no policy is adopted anyway, even when the problem has been clearly identified. Establishing causality. The key to finding a policy solution is to establish a link between the problem and its cause. Causal stories are a tool that policymakers, interest groups, and citizens can use to identify more effective solutions. Establishing causality allows for easy creation of models that directly link effort expended to particular outcomes. Policy problems are complex and often have many causes. The government simply does not have enough time or resources to address all public concerns. So again, policymaking is fundamentally a technical process. It requires knowledge, and most of the problems just seem to stem from lack of knowledge or not enough time to address the problems. And again, power is once again minimized here. Policymakers often make trade-offs between addressing a problem with a partial solution or deciding not to act at all. Cause and effect are open to interpretation and widely different perceptions. Even the individual or group who persuasively persuasively demonstrates their own view of causality guides the policy solution. Now we move on to agendas and agenda setting. An agenda includes all issues currently being discussed by the news media, interest groups, constituents, and the public at large. Kingdon describes the agenda as the list of subjects or problems which government officials are paying some serious attention to, or paying some serious attention at any given time. Agendas are simply plans of actions or lists of topics being considered by the public and policymakers. Each policymaker has different priorities based on personal interests and needs of their home district. There are different agenda levels as well. There's the agenda universe, encompasses all possible ideas that could be discussed or considered by government. Almost any idea could be included, though some are more or less acceptable based on cultural norms. Systemic agenda include all issues commonly perceived by political community members as meriting public attention. This is systemic agenda and involving matters within legitimate government jurisdiction. Institutional agenda contains the list of items explicitly up for active and serious consideration, policy issues that make it into bill form and are assigned to a committee. And then the decision agenda describes problems for which government is actively debating a solution and taking specific actions and making decisions like taking a vote. The border between the agenda universe and systemic agenda is porous, meaning issues flow freely from one level to the next. Only 3% of originally proposed bills are enacted. Only 6% of resolutions are passed during any given Congress. Yes, but what is that 3% and what is that 6%? And whose interests are usually represented by these things? That's the crucial question here. Now, again, they wouldn't deny that wealthy elites play a role in the policymaking process, but they tend to reduce them as just one of many groups, and they don't seem to ascribe to them any particular advantage that they would have over other groups. Billionaires essentially become just another interest group, just another constituent group, trying to influence the policymaking process. It doesn't appear, at least, that they have any particular, special advantage over any other group, which, of course, most people would find to be absurd. Getting ideas on the agenda, prevailing theories. Agenda setting is the process of getting an issue recognized and placed on the agenda. Again, groups, which would presumably include, wealthy elites, capitalists, compete to control the agenda and promote their issues as most important. Groups also compete to keep issues off the agenda. The number of issues governments can address is finite. Think of agenda setting as a bottleneck. Then we'll discuss three prevailing theories regarding this. But again, in this model of things, the interests of the very wealthy are presented just as any other group. There's no indication here that they tend to influence the policy process, or get their interests, tend to win out most of the time, even though there's a mountain of empirical research that supports this as well. And yeah, it just tends to minimize, the influence of power here during this process. So they go through three prevailing theories: a pluralism and elite theory, which they argue are sort of linked to each other. Pluralism follows the belief that everyone has equal access to influence policymaking. Anyone has the power to move public problems onto the agenda. No single group dominates the decision-making process. Again, no single group. So again, from this point of view, the wealthy don't have any, significant advantage over the policymaking process. Elite theory suggests that only a few prominent elites, politicians, businessmen, and the wealthy have the power to influence policymaking. Now, this sounds a little more realistic. Regular citizens are uninformed and uninterested in public policy. Policy reflects values of elites, not demands of regular people. So the policy reflects the values of elites, who themselves are made up of different groups. So this view can be sort of combined with pluralism. You could have different groups, none of which seem to have any particular dominance over the other, but within those groups there are elites that sort of rise up out of these groups, and it's the elites within those groups that essentially drive the policymaking process. But notice what they say here: the idea that regular citizens are more or less disconnected, uninformed, uninterested in public policy. So this sort of gives an alibi to the elites, right? Because it's basically saying, well, the public doesn't really care. So, in that void, the elites sort of, step in and take control of the policymaking process. But that's not actually always true. There are many instances where it seems that the public does have pretty strong views, are interested in the policymaking process. It's just that those views aren't being heard. So notice how this theory casts the idea that if policy doesn't reflect the views of the public, it's because the public isn't making its voice heard enough. But again, what if you have the contrary circumstance where the public is in fact making their voices heard, as we've seen, especially over recent years, over any number of issues, and those voices aren't just being heard? You can't really explain that properly from the point of view of elite theory, which pretty much takes it for granted that the public is uninterested in policy making. That is just not true. It is correct that the policy is dominated by elites, but not just because the public is uninformed or uninterested. It's because the policymaking process favors elites more than it favors the public. Elite theory implies policy issues make it on the agenda from inside the policy process as well. So it's basically the insiders, basically. Policy streams and windows of opportunity. We've already talked about this in a previous class or in the first class. John Kingdon proposed 3 streams that must unite for a policy window to open and place a potential policy on the public agenda. If context aligns and a policy idea has support from policymakers, the issue is considered ripe for a policy solution. Now, again, I'll cover it again, but I already have, if you look back to the first class, basically how this 3 streams approach works. So you have the problem stream, an event that changes a perception of a problem and indicates something is wrong. It can rely on many different things, like statistical data connected to examples are called indicators. Extreme fluctuations in common indicators suggest a problem is forthcoming. Focusing events are sudden and rare events that spark intense media and public attention because of their sheer magnitude or because of the harm they reveal. For example, the September 11th attacks, a nuclear disaster, an oil spill, an unexpected epidemic or pandemic. Hurricane Katrina is another example that the textbook uses. That's the problem stream. Then you have the policy stream, includes any proposals developed to address a particular issue, consist of viable policy options or concrete legislation, technology, or public perception. And then the political stream comes into play when electoral change or change in the public opinion leads to reform. Change in political regime or increasing support for an issue can generate favorable conditions. Changes in public opinion can also influence the political stream as well. So again, the advancement of Kingdon's approach is that it doesn't treat the policymaking process in this kind of linear step-by-step fashion that the usual textbook model, highly based on Harold Laswell's model of policymaking, follows. So it's more about these 3 sort of interacting streams, and they all have to sort of converge at the same time for a policy window to open. Factors affecting policy attention, scope, how widespread the problem has become, issues that reach broader public consciousness are more likely to attract immediate attention, intensity, the strength and depth of reactions from the public, duration, how long the intensity lasts, support for measures often spikes after focusing event, but generally fades within a month. And then resources, policy problems that cost more to fix generate more attention than less costly problems. So again, once again, most of this is just about technical stuff, cost benefit analysis, and lack of knowledge for the most part. Now, this is not covered in the textbook, of course, but I want to discuss some flaws within Kingdon's approach. Again, I've already addressed some of this in the last class, talking about Jessup's idea of structural relational analysis or a structural relational approach, and how that might be a better approach in many ways for understanding how policy is actually made, at least compared to this. But I'd like to give some empirical case examples to show where Kingdon's multiple streams framework kind of breaks down. In other words, situations where you would expect the policy would change, but isn't. And they use 2 very important events: the October 7th, and especially its aftermath, as well as Occupy Wall Street, which goes all the way back to 2011. So the claim I'm making here is that asymmetries of power can override problem and political stream alignment. In other words, because of the entrenchment of certain interests and the power that they have over the policymaking process, that they can essentially block policy from being made, even when the so-called problem stream and the political stream, as well as viable policy options, all seem to be converging at the same time. Or the problem really is in the adoption of policies, even though viable policies exist, and the convergence of the problem stream and the political stream would seem to indicate that some sort of policy should be made, but it just isn't. So again, when problem, policy, and political streams align, policy windows open. Yet we don't see this happening here. So without going through in detail everything that's happened, I'm sure some people have some idea in mind. So October 7th, and particularly the nonstop bombardment of Gaza by Israel since then, clearly poses a problem, clearly falls within the problem stream. Both October 7th itself, of course, but again, really the over 2 years now aftermath of this, going on 3 years, in fact. So it obviously brings a problem into awareness. People are realizing now the problematic nature of U.S. policy towards Israel. It's basically unconditional support for it. So you have the problem stream, you have the political stream, a sharp change in public opinion. Public opinion prior to October 7th was maybe about split, but maybe slightly in favor of Israel. Now, basically, a strong majority of public opinion seems to be opposed to Israel, or at least is in favor of an immediate ceasefire, not like these phony ceasefires that have actually been signed, where Israel has attacked Gaza almost every day since the second ceasefire. But there is a shift towards ceasefire, a conditioning of aid. People don't necessarily support unrestricted or unconditional military support for Israel anymore. Are there viable policies that could be enacted? Yes, ceasefire resolutions, the Leahy law enforcement, which actually obliges the State Department and the Defense Department not to provide military aid towards a country that is seen to be participating in gross human rights abuses, which is certainly on evidence here. So the problem has been identified. The political stream favors doing something. There are viable policies that could be enacted, but nothing happens. There's no change. Unconditional aid continues. So this would seem to contradict or undermine Kingdon's approach. By his approach, you would assume some sort of change in policy would be forthcoming, that a policy window has opened up. Yet nothing happens. And again, once again, the common flaw in many of these theories is they don't seem to properly account for power, for the other kinds of interests at play, to the extent to which Israel plays a strategic role in U.S. foreign policy, which of course aims to dominate the Middle East, and Israel is a crucial player in that strategy for them. I mean, none of those things seem to be addressed at all. If they were, then you could better, a theory is only so good as far as it can explain things, right? So this is a theory to try to explain something, it doesn't really seem to, at face value, give you a good explanation. Whereas if you account for, again, U.S. foreign policy, imperialism, the strategic interests that are at play there, it would seem to provide a very good explanation for why policy hasn't changed, given the interest at play there. But just looking at Kingdon's approach doesn't really give you a good reason as to why policy isn't changing. By all accounts, policy should be changing, given the convergence of these three streams, yet nothing is happening. Same thing with Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street certainly brought to public awareness the problem of inequality in this country. So the problem was properly identified. Within the political stream, again, you see a rising support for taxing wealth, breaking up banks. So once again, the problem stream and the political stream seem to be converging towards some sort of policy change. There are viable policies that could have been enacted. higher taxes on the wealthy, more aggressive efforts to break up big banks, criminal prosecutions for people who engaged in fraud, things like that. So there were viable policies that could have been enacted, but once again, you see no major change, no major Wall Street reform at all. So once again, I would argue this contradicts Kingdon's approach. Here you see the three streams converging. A policy window should be opening up, but nothing seems to happen. And Kingdon's approach by itself doesn't really seem to give you any real way of understanding these things because it doesn't properly account for, again, the power at play here. In the Israel case, public opinion has shifted, policy has not. Again, public opinion 2023 to 2025, majority of Democrats plus a plurality of independents favor conditioning or halting arms to Israel, growing support for a permanent ceasefire, recognition of Palestinian suffering, but yet the response of the U.S. government is to provide unconditional military aid, repeated weapons transfers, veto of many UN ceasefire resolutions. Again, when a ceasefire is finally signed, it's not really followed by Israel at all. I believe over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire of last year. So if anything, it slightly de-escalated Israel's military attacks, but a ceasefire means a ceasefire, and there's just clearly not a ceasefire. So again, Kingdon's blind spot, a favorable shift in the political stream should open a window. Instead, policy is frozen. So again, I think that's a very significant limitation of his approach. Now they address another theoretical approach, the advocacy coalition framework by Sabatier and Jenkins Smith, who developed the Advocacy Coalition Framework, or ACF, to explain policymaking and policy change over time. Advocacy coalitions consist of people from a variety of positions, elected officials, agency officials, interest group leaders, researchers who share a specific belief system and show coordinated activity over time. Competition between coalitions who advocate for their preferred solution is common in the policy process. ACF assumes policies are made in an uncertain and ambiguous environment with multiple actors and government levels taking place over many years or decades. Policy changes occur when groups work together to portray problems in ways that increase likelihood of receiving policymaker attention. Policy core beliefs and values represent a coalition's basic normative commitments and causal perceptions across an entire policy domain or subsystem. So, environmental policy, healthcare policy, things like that. Policy core beliefs are the fundamental glue of coalitions. Notice, once again, that they focus more on beliefs rather than things like, class interests, for example, which would probably tell you more, or would probably tell you why they have those beliefs, because they are correlated with specific class interests. Policy core beliefs versus secondary access. The ACF distinguishes three levels of belief. You have deep core beliefs, fundamental ontology and values. Ontology is basically a belief in what is real. For example, individualism versus community. Example, gun policy. Human nature is basically good versus flawed. So, where you stand on that kind of, existential question will in many ways influence, your views on guns. The policy core, the basic strategies and causal perceptions within a policy domain. So, for example, gun availability causes violence versus mental health causes violence. So these are the sort of core beliefs on both sides of the issue. Some people say that the availability of guns is causing all these mass shootings, whereas gun advocates would say, well, it's a mental health issue. Guns don't kill people; people kill people. We've all heard that expression before. So those are their sort of core beliefs here, at least regarding policy. And then you have secondary beliefs, instrumental decisions, minor rule changes. Instrumental means this is more like how what means to an end are you going to follow. So you have a certain agreement on certain core beliefs, but then there's a different question of like, how do you best achieve those goals? Age limit for handgun purchase, 18 versus 21, for example. Why this matters for agenda setting: coalitions fight hardest over policy core beliefs because those define the problem and legitimate solutions. You can compromise on secondary details, but not on core causality. This is why debates, for example, climate change, become intractable. Opposing coalitions have irreconcilable causal stories baked into their identities. And yes, that is true. But I mean, the debate over things like climate change can be resolved by looking at actual empirical evidence. This is a tendency people also have, is to reduce all policy issues to equal sides. Well, both sides have equally valid points of view. They just can't come to an agreement on things, and that's just complete nonsense, basically. I mean, climate change is a very issue to see. One side is well supported by actual scientific evidence, the other side is not, and so the debate, as I say, is intractable, meaning there's no solution for it, there's no way to resolve it. But it's not. If that is true, it's not because it's impossible to come to some sort of agreement, or there's no way to properly evaluate which side has the better claim. It's in fact very easy to decide that. But once again, power comes into play here, right? The reason why there's no real move on climate change isn't because it's too hard to identify the evidence that makes the climate change narrative seem real. That's not hard to do. What makes it hard to implement policy here is because of the against the immense corporate interests that are preventing something like this from happening. So it's not just that they have deep-seated beliefs, it's because one side has various economic interests at play and has the power to defend those interests. But once again, a lot of these things tend to fall out of the analysis when you analyze policy in this way. The uncertain and ambiguous environment. The ACF assumes policymakers rarely have complete information. So here again, we come to this idea that lack of information is the biggest obstacle, not power. Not that one side has more power than the other. Causes and effects are unclear. Values conflict. Technical data can be interpreted multiple ways. In that fog, coalitions do not simply find the best solution. They advocate for their preferred causal story using research and expertise, lobbying and testimony, and media framing, litigation, venue shopping, moving debate to a friendlier institution. This is a direct rejection of the rational model's assumption that problem identification leads cleanly to optimal solutions. So yes, it may be an advancement over that, but again, still the tendency to fall back upon the idea that lack of information and technical data are the biggest obstacles to be overcome when implementing policy or making and implementing a policy, seems to conceal the impact of power. That's more than just not having information or the technical means available. Even when people do have information, even when there is technical means available, the policies oftentimes do not get made because of the entrenched power, the entrenched interest at play, and the power that they have to influence the policymaking process. Again, a lot of this gets lost at the risk of making the same point over and over again. It's just something that kind of has to be pointed out because the textbook pretty much consistently fails to ever point this out. Unlike one-off interest group lobbying, and again, this even encompasses different theoretical ways of looking at the policymaking process. They all seem to suffer from similar problems. Anyway, the ACF emphasizes long-term coordinated activity across multiple venues. A coalition might lose a legislative battle, then shift to an agency rulemaking, then to courts, then back to Congress years later. Over time, coalitions can experience policy-oriented learning, adjusting secondary beliefs as new evidence emerges while preserving core beliefs. Example, the anti-tobacco coalition spent decades losing before finally winning restrictions. Their core belief, tobacco causes cancer, never changed, but they learned to frame it as a children's health issue, use state attorneys general and pursue litigation. Views of agenda setting. So in pluralism, many groups compete, no single group dominates, access is open. In elite theory, a small elite controls the agenda. These can be considered separately, but there's also a way you can kind of overlap them too, which is that you have pluralism with multiple groups, but those groups are all basically dominated by different elite groups as well. The ACF view, subsystems are dominated by a few stable coalitions with deep belief systems. New actors can enter, but they must align with an existing coalition or form a new one. The agenda reflects coalition competition, not open pluralism or simple elite control. The ACF undermines the rational model more than it admits. The chapter presents ACF as one theory among several, but ACF's emphasis on belief systems as glue suggests that problem identification is not a neutral, evidence-driven process, which of course it is not. Instead, what counts as a problem depends entirely on which coalition's policy core beliefs are dominant in a subsystem at a given time. That is a radical claim. It means policy debates are not about finding the right causal story, but about power struggles between incommensurable worldviews. Again, that is true to a certain extent. I would argue that by reducing everything to beliefs rather than to more or less like objective interests, class interests that people have, that would be an even more radical view. That would be a way to push it even further, I would think. The ACF explains why some problems never reach the agenda. A coalition with strong policy core beliefs can actively suppress competing definitions of a problem. If a subsystem is dominated by a single coalition for years, a policy, a monopoly, as they call it, issues that threaten its core beliefs will be kept off the systemic agenda entirely. Once again, they go back to the tobacco issue. For decades, the tobacco subsystem or the tobacco policy area was dominated by a coalition of tobacco companies, farmers, and friendly legislators. The problem of smoking-related disease was framed as an individual choice, not a public health crisis. That framing kept regulation off the agenda for a generation. Okay. But they pick very, specific issues here, right? One, broader based issues like, taxes, again, foreign policy, military spending, things like that aren't really explored here. Policy windows in ACF terms. Kingdom's windows are relatively short. ACF argues that major policy change usually requires a long-term shift in coalition resources or external shocks. For example, an election that replaces many subsystem members or major focusing events that discredits one coalition's core beliefs. When such a shift occurs, the previously dominant coalition's problem definition becomes unsustainable and the agenda can change rapidly, or a punctuated equilibrium. Now, if we compare these, the rational, the 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 stages of the policymaking process with the ACF approach, you can sort of contrast them here. The rational model, look at indicators, focusing events. ACF, look at which coalition's belief system is currently dominant. Causal stories, the rational model, tool to find effective solutions. The ACF, weapon to defend or attack policy core beliefs. Agenda setting, again, the rational model, linear stages. The ACF is a contested subsystem, issues rise and coalition power shifts. Policy change, again, the rational model, new evidence or analysis drives change. ACF, external shocks or learning that alters coalition resources. Role of values with the rational model is the background factor. For ACF is central, so they bring it to the forefront. But again, values itself can be very subjective, can be very fuzzy. I think you would probably get more out of it if you just change it to more or less, objective class interests. Who sets the agenda? What they refer to as the sub government. Douglas Cater coined the term to describe 3 sets of actors. Congress members on key committees, bureaucrats overseeing the issue, interest groups with a vested interest in the policy outcome. Influential Congress members can use the committee process to direct policy debate and set the agenda. This is a common thing in Congress when they don't want to vote on a certain law. They bury it so far down the agenda. The Congress simply runs out of time. The session of Congress ends before they even get to vote on something. Bureaucrats are non-elected government officials. Nearly 90% of laws created by administrative rules issued by federal or state agencies. For example, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Department of Health and Human Services. Level of bureaucratic influence depends on how issues are framed and defined and the amount of control exerted by the president, Congress, and courts. Interest groups. Lobbying groups spend upwards of $3 billion a year to influence public policy. Interest groups are highly strategic in taking a proactive approach to agenda setting. Groups start with a list of issues that promote their interest, refine into a smaller list of priorities, then concentrate on issues with a legitimate shot at success. Interest groups are highly sensitive to the presence of an open window. The most effective interest groups are prepared to seize the moment. Media is both a player and referee in the game of politics. Media effects on agenda setting include ability to identify issues and set the agenda, ability to influence viewpoints and opinions on policy issues, ability to influence behavior of citizens and policymakers. So how a topic is presented to the audience affects the choices people make about how to process that information. This is known as framing. Citizens themselves. The group that successfully describes a problem will also be the one that defines the solution to it. Well, of course, that is not true. Again, we have many instances where people have described the problem and even described the solutions to it, and yet that is never adopted. Why? Because they lack the power. The useful problem definition should be both specific and realistic. Problem should be framed in a broader context. Problem definition should identify a desired outcome. Define the problem in public terms that are brief and memorable. Gather research to support claims and bolster credibility. Identify who in government can fix the problem. Make a plan to build coalitions and solicit media help when necessary. Voting is one of the most direct and effective methods for citizens to influence the agenda. But of course, this presumes that who you're voting for actually represents a real choice when it comes to policy. When it comes to Israel, for example, it doesn't really matter who you vote for, right? Both parties equally support Israel, so voting there really doesn't matter at all. Same thing with many other issues, military spending, healthcare. Neither party supports, single payer healthcare. There are minor differences between the two on some of these issues, taxes, but they don't really represent a substantial difference from one another. Case studies, setting the healthcare agenda. President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act in March 2010. Healthcare reform was a priority for President Obama even before taking office. Bill Clinton had previously campaigned on healthcare reform more than a decade earlier, but opposition from conservatives in the healthcare industry thwarted his plan. By 2009, over 44 million Americans lacked health insurance. Americans have become increasingly supportive of government intervention in health insurance reform. President Obama used the bully pulpit as a tool to advocate for his agenda, his ability to speak before the American people. Research found that more speeches Obama gave on healthcare corresponded with an increase in positive tone of articles discussing the bill. The first dominant frame focused on politics or policy implications. The second defined reform as an economic transaction. Media spent little time explaining implications of proposed reforms. The Massachusetts plan, including individual mandate and insurance exchange, served as a guide during policy development. All three of Kingdon's streams aligned, opening a window of opportunity that led to the passage of the ACA. But again, the ACA was also passed because, or passed in the form that it was because of the power of the healthcare industry overall. They were able to, successfully, water down the law to the extent that it didn't really pose any real threat to their profit motives. Healthcare, of course, have continued to go up, of course, and we're able to block not only single payer healthcare, but even a public option included in the bill, giving people the option to, you know, be enrolled in a public health insurance program, government funded health insurance program. So in this case, yes, the three streams align, but even there, power played a role in shaping the overall form of the law and what was included and what was not. And again, I very provided other examples where these streams do align, and yet no policy is actually made. So again, to summarize the chapter, public problems are identified and then included on the agenda. Policy agendas can be formal list of bills or less formal collection of topics of interest to policymakers. The agenda setting process encompasses a complex set of steps and actors. Elites, bureaucrats, media, interest groups, and citizens all have the ability to set the agenda. Agenda setting is one of the most important steps in the policy process. This is where public problems are identified, solutions are defined, and topics gain and lose importance. Now, again, just to contrast it once again with the SRA approach, this idea that problems are objective, the SRA approach, the structural relational approach or structural relational analysis, problems are constructed and strategically selected. An issue gains prominence not because it's inherently more important, but because powerful actors can frame it in a way that resonates and aligns with the strategic selectivity of the moment. A causal story is a strategy employed by actors within a strategically selective context. When it comes to agenda setting is a fluid, contested, and irrational practice of organized anarchy. Issues don't simply progress through levels, they are promoted, ignored, or actively suppressed depending on the changing balance of social forces and political struggles. Windows of opportunity are actively created through strategic action in a specific conjuncture. They emerge when political, economic, and social crises create a fluid situation where previously unthinkable solutions become plausible. Jessup would analyze the Thatcherite conjuncture, the coming to power and the policies of Margaret Thatcher, who, if you don't know, was sort of like the Ronald Reagan, I guess, of the United Kingdom. Free market, privatization, as a moment where a radical neoliberal project was strategically pursued and succeeded in reshaping the state. The stages are separate and sequential from the SRA approach. Structures, strategies, and discourses co-evolve. The problem, the policy solution, and the political situation are not independent streams, in contrast to Kingdon. They are co-constituted. For example, an advocacy coalition's core values, its philosophy of praxis, shape how it defines the problem, which solutions it champions, and which political allies it seeks. All right, so you have multiple approaches to understanding the early stages of the policy process. Again, I think the key thing to remember here is how power plays a role in shaping the policymaking process. Unfortunately, in all but the SRA approach, I would say it does not. The different theoretical approaches to understanding policymaking do not properly account for this. They do not properly account for the unbalanced power, essentially of economic elites regarding the policymaking process as a whole, and of course, relative to other groups in society. All right, so we'll continue this obviously as we go through the rest of the policymaking process, but for now, I'm going to wrap things up. Yeah, this basically is just emphasizing what I'm saying here. Okay, all right, so take care, everyone.